sun rose slowly over the small town of Millstone, painting the streets in shades of gold and orange. It was a quiet morning and the world seemed calm. Among the early risers was David Miller, a man known for his kindness, honesty, and hard work. He owned a tiny mechanic shop at the corner of Maple Street, a place where the smell of engine oil mixed with the laughter of regular customers. David's life was simple, but it was built on pride and integrity. Every morning he kissed his wife Anna goodbye before walking to work with a smile. His young daughter Lily would wave from the porch, her tiny hands covered in pancake syrup. "Fix cars, Daddy, but come home early." She'd shout. He would laugh every time, promising he would at his shop. David worked long hours fixing broken engines, patching tires, and helping people who couldn't afford repairs. Sometimes, when a struggling mother came in with a damaged car, he'd quietly fix it for free, telling her to pay when she could. People respected him for that. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was the kind of man who made others believe there was still goodness in the world. His best friend Joe often teased him, "You're too soft, David. You'll never be rich that way." But David always smiled and replied, "I'd rather be honest than rich, Joe. Money fades, but peace doesn't." Life went on smoothly. The town trusted David completely, and the police often came by to get their vehicles repaired, even offering him small maintenance contracts. Ironically, it was through one of those officers, Detective Harris, that David's nightmare would begin. Detective Harris was known for his pride. He liked to look successful. Even when his cases weren't going well, he hated mistakes. And when one of his investigations started to crumble, he would do anything to cover it up. One chilly evening, as David closed his shop, a robbery took place a few streets away. The thief wore gloves and escaped into the night, leaving behind only a single wrench with fingerprints. That wrench was from David's shop, one he had lent to a young customer earlier that day. The next morning, David was in his kitchen, laughing with his daughter when there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Detective Harris standing there, two other officers behind him. "David Miller?" Harris asked sharply. "You're under arrest for armed robbery." David froze. His wife gasped. "There must be some mistake," she cried. But Harris ignored her. He pulled out the wrench sealed in a plastic bag. "This was found at the crime scene," he said coldly. David's hands trembled. "That's my tool, yes, but I wasn't there. I was home all night," he pleaded. But no one listened. The officers handcuffed him as his daughter clung to her mother, crying, "Daddy." The ride to the police station felt unreal. David kept thinking it would all be cleared up soon. He believed in justice, in fairness, in truth. He had fixed the police cars, helped his neighbors. He couldn't believe the same town that once trusted him now looked at him with suspicion. Days passed, then weeks. The trial began, and David sat in the courtroom watching his life unravel. The prosecutor painted him as a desperate man who needed money. Detective Harris lied smoothly, claiming he had evidence linking David to the robbery. The wrench, the fake witness statement. Everything seemed carefully arranged. David's lawyer tried to defend him, but the case was too strong, too polished. The jury didn't see the kind, humble mechanic. They saw what the detective wanted them to see. A guilty man. Through it all, David never shouted, never cursed. He looked at the judge with calm eyes. "I didn't do this," he said softly. "But if you believe I did, then I'll still pray for you to find the truth someday." Those words made the courtroom fall silent for a brief moment. But it wasn't enough. The gavel came down, and the judge said the words that would change his life forever. Guilty. 10 years in prison. That night in the cold gray cell, David sat on the small bed staring at the wall. His hands were calloused from years of work, and now they trembled. He thought of his wife and daughter. He thought of the wrench, of Harris's cold smile, and though fear and pain filled his heart, one thing stayed the same, his faith in truth. He whispered quietly to himself, "They can take my freedom, but not my honesty." The stars outside the barred window flickered faintly, and for the first time David realized how fragile life was. A single lie had destroyed everything he had, yet even in that darkness, a spark of hope still lived inside him, a belief that someday, somehow the truth would find its way back. That belief would become the light that guided him through the years of pain ahead. And eventually, it would be the reason why the same judge who sentenced him would one day weep in front of him, not out of guilt but out of awakening. The days after David's arrest felt like a nightmare that refused to end. The news spread quickly across the small town. Local mechanic arrested in armed robbery. The same people who once waved at him now crossed the street to avoid him. His name, once spoken with respect, was now whispered in doubt. His wife, Anna, tried to stay strong for their daughter, but the weight of fear and shame began to crush her heart. In his small jail cell, David sat quietly, trying to make sense of how his life had turned upside down overnight. He replayed every detail in his head, searching for an answer, for something that could prove his innocence. But the truth was cruel. Everything pointed to him. His wrench was found at the scene. His fingerprints matched, and Detective Harris had written a detailed report that made it look airtight. The day of his first hearing, the courtroom was packed. Journalists whispered, cameras clicked, and people stared as he was led inside in handcuffs. His wife sat in the front row, her eyes red from crying. His little daughter clutched a teddy bear. Looking around, confused, Detective Harris took the stand first. His voice was calm, his uniform spotless. He spoke like a man of authority. "We received an anonymous tip placing David Miller near the crime scene," he said. "Upon investigation, we found this wrench belonging to his workshop." He paused dramatically. "It matches the tool used to break open the store's safe." The prosecutor nodded confidently, as if the case was already won. David's lawyer, a young public defender named Ryan, stood up. "Detective Harris, did you personally see my client at the crime scene?" he asked. Harris smiled slightly. "No, but all the evidence proves it," Ryan pressed on. "Did you check security cameras?" "They were conveniently broken," Harris replied smoothly. His tone made it sound like fate itself wanted David guilty. David sat silently, his hands gripping the table. He wanted to shout, to tell everyone that he had been home, but his voice trembled with disbelief. He couldn't understand how someone could lie so easily. When it was his turn to speak, he stood, looking directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I have never stolen a thing in my life," he said softly. "I fix cars for a living. I help people. I was home with my family that night, please. Believe me." The courtroom was silent for a moment, but the prosecutor quickly interrupted. "Mr. Miller, the evidence says otherwise. We're not here for stories, we're here for facts." Those words hit him like a hammer. His truth meant nothing against the lies. As the days went on, more witnesses were brought in, all repeating the same false narrative. Someone had claimed they saw David near the store. Another said they heard his truck drive by. All of it was built on Detective Harris's lies, carefully layered to make him look guilty. Anna visited him in jail after the hearing. Her eyes were swollen from crying. "David, what are we going to do?" she whispered through the glass. He placed his hand on the cold surface. "I don't know, but I swear I didn't do it," she nodded, though her voice cracked. "I believe you. I always will." Outside, life went on without him. His shop was shut down, his reputation destroyed. The small town that once respected him now saw him as a criminal. Meanwhile, Detective Harris sat in his office. Satisfied, to him it was just another closed case, another promotion waiting. He didn't care that an innocent man's life was falling apart. All he wanted was credit and recognition. In the courtroom, the final hearing approached. The evidence was all stacked against David. His lawyer tried one last time to prove inconsistencies, but the system didn't want to listen. Harris's lies sounded cleaner, sharper, and more believable than David's truth. The judge sighed as she looked down at the papers. Her face showed a hint of doubt. "But her hands were tied by evidence, Mr. Miller," she said, her tone heavy. "Based on the presented facts, this court finds you guilty of armed robbery." David closed his eyes as the words echoed in the room. His wife cried out, "No, he's innocent." But her voice was drowned by the clatter of the gavel. The bailiffs led him away. His heart felt like it was being torn apart, not by fear but by betrayal. He had trusted the system, the law, the very people who now crushed him under falsehoods. That night, as he sat alone in his cold prison cell, the truth of his situation settled in. He wasn't just fighting lies, he was fighting power. Corruption and injustice, the kind that doesn't care about truth. But deep inside he whispered to himself, "They can't destroy my soul." His eyes burned with quiet fire. He didn't know how or when, but he made a silent promise. One day, the truth would come out, and when it did, the world would see what lies had stolen from him. And that promise, the small spark of hope in his heart, was what would one day make a powerful judge cry, not from guilt, but from the realization of how one man's faith could outshine the darkness of injustice. The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of ceiling fans turning above. The smell of old wood and paper filled the air, and the heavy curtains let in only a small stream of sunlight. David sat in the defendant's chair, hands cuffed in front of him. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights. Across from him sat Detective Harris, sharp in his pressed uniform, wearing a smirk that looked too proud for someone who claimed to be serving justice. The trial had entered its final stages, and the energy in the room felt thick with tension. The townspeople filled every seat, whispering quietly. They had once trusted David, the man who fixed their cars and helped their children, but now, doubt painted their faces. It was easier to believe the man in uniform than the mechanic in chains. David's lawyer, Ryan, stood up to make his closing argument. He was young, nervous, but determined. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have heard a lot of words in this courtroom, but words can lie, evidence can be planted, reports can be twisted, but truth cannot be buried forever." He paused, his voice trembling slightly. "David Miller is not a criminal. He is a husband, a father, a man who has lived with honesty and kindness his entire life. Are we really going to destroy that because one officer says he's guilty?" The judge's eyes softened for a brief second, but Detective Harris's calm confidence quickly filled the silence. He leaned forward, whispering something to the prosecutor, who nodded. Then the prosecutor stood and began his rebuttal. "With all due respect," he said, "this is not about emotions, it's about facts. The evidence is clear. Fingerprints, the wrench, witness statements. Everything points to Mr. Miller's guilt." He turned toward the jury, his voice low but firm. "Justice requires us to act, not to feel." David sat motionless, his heart pounding. He could see Anna in the crowd, clutching their daughter's hand. Her face was pale, her eyes wet. When his eyes met hers, she mouthed the words, "I believe you." And for a brief moment he felt strong again. The judge asked if he wanted to speak before sentencing. David stood slowly, his shackles clinking softly against the floor. The room went silent, all eyes on him. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I know what everyone here thinks of me. I know it's easier to believe a man in uniform than a man in grease-stained clothes. But I didn't commit that crime. I wasn't even near that place. I was home, holding my daughter while she fell asleep." He took a deep breath. "I've lived my whole life fixing what's broken. Cars, machines, sometimes people's trust, but now, something inside this courtroom is broken and I don't know how to fix it." His words hung in the air, fragile and honest. Even the judge looked away for a moment. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken emotion. Detective Harris folded his arms and looked smug, knowing the damage was already done. The evidence he had faked was perfect. No one could trace it back to him. He had sealed David's fate with a signature and a lie. When the jury returned, their expressions were blank. The foreman stood and spoke the words that shattered David's world. "We, the jury, find the defendant, David Miller, guilty as charged." A gasp ran through the courtroom. Anna cried out, "No! Please, he didn't do it." But the bailiff stepped forward to quiet her. The judge's voice was calm but heavy. "David Miller, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in state prison." The gavel struck, sharp and final. It echoed like thunder through David's chest. As he was led away, his daughter screamed, "Daddy!" and tried to run toward him, but Anna held her back, sobbing. David turned for one last look. His eyes met theirs through the blur of tears and glass. He forced a small smile, the kind meant to comfort others even when your own world is falling apart. Back in his cell that night, the world felt quieter than ever. The walls around him seemed to close in. The metal bars cast long shadows across the floor. He sat on the hard bed, his hands trembling, not from fear but from disbelief. He thought about all the times he had trusted the system, all the times he'd believed good people always won. Now he saw how easily lies could destroy a life. Still, in that silence, a small fire burned in him. He whispered to himself, "Truth doesn't die, even if it's buried." And though he didn't know it yet, those words would become his strength. They would carry him through years of injustice, through loneliness and pain, until the day when those who once condemned him would be forced to face their own guilt. For now he was just a man in a cell, broken but not defeated, waiting for the world to remember that even in a room full of lies, one honest heart can still change everything. The first night in prison was long, cold and endless. David sat on a thin mattress, staring at the steel bars that now defined his world. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, distant shouts from other inmates breaking the silence. He had always believed in justice, but now justice had locked him away. Days turned into weeks and reality began to sink in. The food was tasteless, the air was heavy, and time felt slower than it ever had before. Some inmates were cruel, others quiet, but all carried stories of pain. David kept to himself at first, avoiding trouble still. Every night he whispered the same words to himself. I didn't do it. At home, Anna struggled to keep their lives together. She worked double shifts and raised their daughter alone. Little Lily would ask, when is Daddy coming home? And every time Anna's heart broke a little more, she would hug her daughter tight and whisper, soon, baby, soon. Even though she didn't know if it was true, back in prison, David found a strange peace in helping others. Some inmates couldn't read or write, so he started teaching them with torn scraps of paper. One letter at a time, he'd say with a smile. Slowly, they began to respect him. They called him Teacher Dave, a man who never cursed, never fought. One night, as he helped an older prisoner named Carl write a letter to his family, Carl asked, why do you help us, man? After what they did to you? David smiled faintly. Because anger won't fix anything. But kindness still can. Those words began to spread through the prison, and soon even the guards noticed him. David had a calmness that seemed impossible in a place built on fear. But deep inside, pain never left him every time he saw the prison walls. He remembered the courtroom, the lies, the smirk on Detective Harris's face. He often thought about the judge, the woman who had sentenced him without truly knowing him. He didn't hate her. He pitied her, because one day she would have to face the truth. Years passed and the seasons changed. His hair grew grayer, but his spirit didn't fade. He became the quiet soul everyone went to for advice. Inmates shared their stories, and David listened with patience, telling them, we can't change what happened, but we can choose what we become. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, life had changed. Detective Harris continued to rise in his career. Celebrated for his sharp instincts, he appeared on the news boasting about closing another case. But fate has a way of circling back to truth one day. A young officer named Daniel was going through old files. He was assigned to review closed cases, and David's case caught his attention. Something didn't add up. The evidence timeline was inconsistent, the fingerprints too conveniently found. The deeper Daniel looked, the stranger it became at the same time. Rumors began to spread in the police department about Harris's involvement in shady investigations. A few people whispered that he had framed suspects before to earn promotions. David knew nothing of this. He woke up each morning, said a small prayer, and started his day the same way, helping, teaching, surviving. But one afternoon, as he swept the prison yard, a guard approached him with a message. Miller, you've got visitors. He frowned, confused. When he entered the small visiting room, he saw his wife and daughter waiting, but also a young man in uniform. Mr. Miller, the man said, my name's Officer Daniel Price. I've been reviewing your case, and I believe you were wrongfully convicted. The world seemed to stop for a moment. David's breath caught in his throat. Anna covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Daniel continued, we've found evidence that the detective falsified his report. It's going to take time, but we're reopening your case. For the first time in years, David smiled, not a forced one, but a real soft smile filled with hope. Thank you, he whispered, his voice trembling. That night, lying in his bunk, he looked up at the ceiling and whispered, maybe truth really doesn't die. The stars outside the small barred window seemed to shimmer brighter, as if the universe itself was finally starting to listen. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, the darkness didn't feel endless somewhere out there. The truth was rising again, and when it reached the courtroom, it would not only set him free but also change the hearts of those who had once condemned him, especially the judge whose eyes would soon fill with tears when she faced the man she had once sent to prison. The morning light slipped through the narrow window of David's cell, falling across his face like a quiet promise. For the first time in years, he woke up with a feeling that was almost foreign to him. Hope. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the gray walls that had trapped him for so long. But today they didn't seem as heavy. Somewhere beyond those walls, the truth was finally stirring. A week after Officer Daniel's visit, whispers began to spread through the prison. The guards treated him differently, more gently, almost respectfully. One of them handed him a fresh uniform and said quietly, heard your case is being reopened, Miller. Maybe justice is finally catching up. David smiled faintly. Justice never runs fast, he replied, but it always arrives when it's ready. The next few months were filled with waiting. Endless paperwork and more questions from investigators. But David didn't mind. Every question brought him closer to freedom, closer to the life stolen from him. He spent his days teaching other inmates and writing letters to his daughter, who was now a teenager. In one letter he wrote, "Don't let the world make you bitter, Lily. Let it make you brave." Outside the prison, Officer Daniel worked tirelessly to expose Detective Harris's lies. He gathered new statements, old case files, and forensic reports that didn't match. Slowly, the truth began to take shape, a picture of corruption, manipulation, and deceit. Harris had framed at least 3 innocent men, and David was one of them. When the news broke, it hit the town like a storm. The same people who once whispered against David now whispered about Harris. The hero cop was suddenly a criminal. The media called it one of the biggest justice scandals in the county's history. One cold morning, a letter arrived for David. It was stamped by the state attorney's office. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single sentence. "Your conviction has been overturned. You are hereby exonerated of all charges." For a long moment, he couldn't move, his eyes blurred with tears. The paper slipped from his fingers as he whispered, "It's over." The next day, the gates of the prison opened. The cold air hit his face, sharp and real. He stepped out slowly, feeling the ground beneath his feet as though it was the first time he'd walked on earth. Anna was waiting there, holding Lily close. When Lily saw him, she ran into his arms, crying, "Daddy, you're really home." He held her tight, burying his face in her hair. "Yes, baby, I'm home," he whispered. Anna hugged him, her tears falling freely. "I told you I'd wait," she said softly. "I never stopped believing." David pulled back, his voice trembling. "You were my strength." "Both of you," reporters surrounded them, flashing cameras and shouting questions, but he ignored them all. For him, this wasn't about headlines, it was about healing. A week later, David received an official invitation from the court. The same judge who had once sentenced him wanted to meet him personally. At first he hesitated. The memories of that day still haunted him. But then he thought of something he had written long ago in his letters. Forgiveness is freedom too, so he agreed. The courtroom felt different this time, brighter, quieter. The chains were gone, replaced by the soft weight of justice finally restored. The judge sat before him, older now, her expression heavy with regret. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice trembling, "there are no words that can undo what you endured. I am deeply sorry for the pain this court caused you." David looked at her, not with anger, but with understanding. "Your Honor," he said softly. "You only saw what you were shown. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." The room was silent. The judge's eyes filled with tears. "You've every right to hate me," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "Hate doesn't heal," he said. "Forgiveness does." And then, slowly, he pulled something from his pocket, a small Bible. Worn and faded. "This belonged to my mother," he said, placing it on the judge's desk. "She always told me that faith isn't about escaping pain. It's about walking through it with grace." The judge's hands trembled as she touched the old book. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "You are a better man than most," she said quietly. David smiled softly. "Not better, just blessed with a truth that couldn't stay hidden." As he turned to leave, everyone in the courtroom stood in silence. Some clapped softly, others simply wiped their eyes. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer than ever. David closed his eyes, breathing it in. He didn't think about the years he had lost. He thought about the life still waiting to be lived for the first time in a long time. He wasn't a prisoner of lies, he was a symbol of truth, a reminder that justice may bend, but it can never fully break, and somewhere deep inside, he knew. The same truth that set him free would one day make the world better for someone else. The morning after his release felt like a dream David never wanted to wake from. The sunlight streaming through his kitchen window looked different now. Warmer, real, alive. He sat at the old wooden table with his wife and daughter, eating breakfast together for the first time in years. The sound of their laughter filled the room, and for once, silence didn't mean sadness, it meant peace. Yet even in that peace, something deeper stirred inside him. A quiet unease that came not from anger, but from purpose. He had his freedom back, yes. But what about the years that were stolen from him? What about the truth that so many others never got to prove? He knew his story couldn't end with his release. It had to mean something more. Later that week, the same courthouse that once broke his heart invited him back again. This time, not as a defendant but as an honored guest. The judge who had once sentenced him stood beside the new district attorney, waiting as David walked in through the tall glass doors. The entire courtroom rose when he entered. The people who had once judged him now looked at him with admiration and remorse. The judge spoke first, her voice trembling. David Miller's case reminds us that justice is not perfect, but it must always seek the truth. Today we not only clear his name, we acknowledge his strength, his patience, and his grace. David took a deep breath, stepped forward, and looked around the courtroom. I don't stand here today to celebrate victory, he said, his voice calm but powerful. I stand here to remind everyone that truth doesn't need to shout, it only needs to endure. The audience sat completely still, hanging on his every word. For years, I hated these walls, he continued, glancing around. I thought they only existed to destroy lives. But I've learned that even in the darkest places, compassion can grow. I saw it in the faces of prisoners who still believed in second chances. I saw it in my family, who never gave up on me. And today I see it in all of you. The judge lowered her eyes. Visibly moved, her hand trembled as she reached for a tissue. But David wasn't done. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded note. When I was in prison, he said softly, I wrote something I never planned to read out loud. But I think this is the right moment. He unfolded it and read, If I ever walk free again, I will not ask the world to remember my suffering, but to remember what suffering taught me, that forgiveness heals deeper than anger, and that truth, no matter how long it sleeps, always wakes up. The judge covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Mr. Miller, she whispered, you have no idea how deeply your words will stay with me. He smiled gently. Maybe that's all I wanted, he said after the ceremony. Reporters surrounded him outside the courthouse, microphones and cameras flashing. Mr. Miller, one asked, what will you do now? David paused for a moment, then said, I'll start helping others who've been wrongfully accused. People lose their freedom every day because someone lies. If I can help even one of them find justice, then maybe everything I went through was worth it. And he meant it. Within months, David began working with organizations that helped exonerate the innocent. He visited prisons, talked to inmates, and told his story to anyone who would listen. One evening, after giving a speech at a local law school, a young student approached him. Mr. Miller, she said shyly, your story made me want to become a lawyer. I want to fight for people like you. David smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. Then promise me something, he said. When you stand before a judge, don't just look for evidence, look for truth. As he left the building that night, the sky was filled with stars, the same stars he used to stare at from his prison window. But now they felt closer, brighter. He realized that freedom wasn't just about walking outside those gates. It was about freeing his heart from the bitterness that tried to chain it. And though Detective Harris would soon be facing his own trial, David didn't wish him harm. When reporters later asked if he wanted revenge, he simply said, no, I don't need him to suffer. I just need him to see what honesty looks like. That night, sitting on his porch with his family, David looked out at the horizon and smiled. Truth took its time, he said quietly, but it found me. Anna leaned her head on his shoulder. And it changed more than just your life, she whispered. He nodded, watching the stars shimmer above. Maybe that's what truth does, he said softly. It doesn't just set one man free, it wakes up the world. The months that followed were unlike anything David had ever imagined. He had gone from being a forgotten prisoner to a man whose story was told on television. In newspapers and across social media, people called him the man who forgave, and though the title humbled him, he never let it make him proud. For him, it wasn't about fame, it was about faith, truth, and second chances. He often said in interviews, I didn't forgive because it was easy, I forgave because I didn't want to stay in prison twice. Once behind bars and once inside my heart. His words resonated everywhere, from classrooms to courthouses, and slowly, he began to use his story to change how people thought about justice. One bright morning, David received a letter in the mail. It was from the judge, the same woman who had once sentenced him. The letter was handwritten, filled with emotion. Dear Mr. Miller, I have replayed your case in my mind countless times, and every time your words come back to me. You said truth doesn't need to shout, it only needs to endure because of you. I have decided to step down from my position and dedicate my life to helping reform the justice system. Thank you for teaching me what true justice really means. Judge Evelyn Carter. David read the letter slowly. His hands trembling, a single tear rolled down his cheek. He didn't see it as victory, it was healing. The kind that came not from revenge, but from redemption. A few weeks later, the news announced that Detective Harris had been arrested and was facing trial for multiple cases of corruption and perjury. David was asked to testify, but when the day came, he looked at the man who had stolen 10 years of his life and felt no anger. Instead, he simply said to the court, "I don't wish him harm. I only hope he learns what the truth feels like." The room was silent. Harris couldn't meet his eyes, and for the first time, David realized that forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was freedom. After the trial, David continued his work, traveling to different cities and speaking at law schools, churches, and prisons. He told his story not with bitterness, but with warmth. He spoke about how a lie can destroy a life, but truth once found can rebuild it stronger than before. At one of his events, a young journalist asked, "Mr. Miller, after all the pain, all the lost years, how do you stay so calm?" David smiled. "Because I learned that peace isn't what happens when life is perfect. It's what happens when your heart finally lets go." His daughter, Lily, who was now grown, often joined him on stage. Telling her own story, she would say, "My dad taught me that heroes aren't the ones who fight, they're the ones who forgive." Their bond was unbreakable, stronger than it had ever been on quiet evenings. They would sit on the porch together, watching the sun go down, and she'd say, "You changed so many lives." "Dad," he would laugh softly. "Maybe, but really, it was the truth that changed everything." One evening, he received an invitation from the governor's office. He was to be honored for his contribution to justice reform. At the ceremony, surrounded by dignitaries and cameras, he gave a speech that would later go viral. "Justice," he said, "isn't about punishment, it's about perspective. It's about seeing people not as mistakes, but as human beings capable of change. I was once seen as a criminal, but today I stand here free, not because the world gave me back my life, but because I chose not to lose my heart." The audience rose to their feet in applause, but David simply bowed his head, whispering a quiet thank you to the heavens. Later that night, as he walked home under the starlit sky, he thought about everything, the pain, the lies, the lost years, and the miracle of truth finding its way back. The world had changed around him, but what mattered most was that he had changed within. He had once been a man broken by injustice. Now he was a man rebuilt by grace, and deep in his heart, he knew his story was no longer just about one man's suffering. It was about what happens when forgiveness becomes stronger than anger, when truth becomes louder than lies, and when compassion turns pain into purpose, because sometimes the most powerful justice isn't handed down by a court. It's found in the heart of the one who chooses to forgive. Years passed, but the memory of those dark prison walls never left David's heart. Instead of haunting him, though, they became the foundation of his purpose. He had turned his pain into power, his silence into strength, and his suffering into a voice that the world could no longer ignore. Everywhere he went, people listened, not to the story of a victim, but to the wisdom of a man who turned injustice into light. David's nonprofit organization, Truth Reborn, grew rapidly. It helped free dozens of wrongfully convicted people, provided legal support to families who couldn't afford justice, and inspired countless others to believe in second chances. His story was even made into a documentary that touched millions around the world. People cried not because they pitied him, but because they saw in him what it meant to rise above pain without bitterness. One morning, as he walked through the city park, he noticed a young man sitting alone on a bench, head down, tears in his eyes. David recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had lost faith. He sat beside him and asked gently, "Rough day?" The young man nodded. "I just got out of prison," he said quietly. "They finally proved I was innocent, but I don't know how to start over." David smiled, his eyes kind and steady. "You already have," he said. "The day you chose not to let hate lead your life, that's the day you started again." The young man looked up, surprised. You're David Miller, right?" David chuckled softly. "Yes, but I'm just another man who fell and got up again. The only difference is, I learned that forgiveness builds stronger bridges than revenge ever could." They talked for hours, and as David left, the young man stood taller, his face no longer filled with despair. That was what David lived for. Not applause, not recognition, but the quiet miracles that happened when hope was passed from one heart to another. Later that year, David was invited to speak at a global conference on justice reform. His name was introduced alongside world leaders, activists and scholars, but when he walked on stage, he didn't speak like a politician or an expert. He spoke like a man who had lived through the storm and learned how to dance in the rain. He began slowly. When I was locked in that cell, I used to stare through a small crack in the wall every night. I'd see a piece of the sky, just a sliver of it, and I'd tell myself, the sky is still there even if I can't reach it yet. That's what truth is, it's always there, waiting for the moment you're ready to see it again. The audience was silent, drawn into his voice. People ask me if I regret those lost years, he continued. I used to, but not anymore. Because those years taught me that forgiveness isn't something you give others. It's a gift you give yourself. Without it, you remain a prisoner even when the doors are open. As he finished, the room erupted in applause. Some stood with tears in their eyes. Others clapped in awe. Cameras flashed, but David didn't smile for fame. He smiled because he knew his words had reached where they needed to. After the conference, a journalist approached him. Mr. Miller, she said softly, you've changed so many lives. But what changed yours the most? He looked thoughtful for a moment before replying. A lie put me in prison, but the truth set me free still. It wasn't the truth of the world. It was the truth of my heart. That's the one that mattered that night. Back at home, he sat on his porch with Anna and Lily. The sky above them glittered with stars. The same stars he once watched through iron bars. Lily leaned her head on his shoulder. Dad, she said, do you ever miss the life you had before all this? David smiled gently. No, he said. Because that life ended so this one could begin, I lost 10 years. But I gained something greater, peace, purpose, and the chance to show the world that light is always stronger than darkness. Anna reached for his hand. You turned pain into something beautiful, she whispered. David looked out into the night, the wind soft against his face. No, he said quietly. Truth did. The stars shone brighter. The world felt still, and for the first time in a long time, everything was exactly as it should be, because in the end, David Miller's story wasn't about what the world took from him. It was about what he chose to give back. And that's how a man once broken by lies became a symbol of truth, forgiveness, and the unshakable power of the human spirit.